Did tariffs cause the Great Depression? Is Trump and his new tariffs and trade war going to cause a new Great Depression? This is what mainstream media and most political commentators and influencers are asking, and for good reason. But as we all know, mainstream media is really not very reliable. And political commentators and influencers are generally fairly unreliable as well. So I did the only thing that I could. I went and looked at the history of tariffs, if they caused the Great Depression, and if they might cause a new Great Depression. So let's get into it. Let's start off with the first one. So I went to Google and I typed in a very simple question of, did tariffs cause the Great Depression? Because that is one of the main arguments, or you could just say the main argument that mainstream media and most political commentators and influencers, as I said, are pointing towards, of why Trump is ruining America. Let's get into it. Did tariffs cause a Great Depression? While the stock market crash of 1929 is often seen as the trigger, tariffs, particularly the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, significantly exacerbated the Great Depression. They did not cause the initial downturn, but they worsened the economic crisis by reducing international trade and sparking retaliatory measures from other countries. That's the AI answer on Google. And it doesn't list stats and specific numbers aside from the years. And myself, being someone who is very skeptical of most things, I wanted to find out far more, as you can kind of already imagine. But let's get into this even deeper, because again, if you look at this and say, oh yeah, this is exactly it, you are not looking deep enough, right? The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is what this said, significantly exacerbated the Great Depression. What is it? This act, signed into law in June 1930, raised import tariffs on thousands of goods by an average of 40 to 60%. That is a massive amount. Now, Trump is obviously he has the biggest tariffs, he has the best tariffs, nobody's ever seen tariffs like him. He's going to do the most amazing tariffs, right? I mean, he has already, I think it was 145% last I checked, or maybe that he was just talking about 145%. Either way, it is certainly over 100%. At least that's what I'm aware of. But either way, 40 to 60% is a massive amount of tariff throughout history. So, what was the impact on trade? The act led to a sharp decline in international trade and a collapse of global markets, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So, I mean, this is a big organization. They, at the very least, probably are fairly legitimate in their findings But this is also just one sentence. So have to look into that more. Retaliatory measures. Other countries responded by imposing their own tariffs on U.S. goods, further hindering trade. So trade globally, as it said, just collapsed. Economic consequences. The reduction in trade, along with other factors like the stock market crash and monetary contraction, deepened the economic downturn. So basically, economic growth wasn't happening. Instead, it was the opposite. It was the opposite of growth. So economies were shrinking. Okay. Again, one sentence. AI Google. Not the primary cause. Economists generally agree that while tariffs contributed to the severity of the Great Depression, they were not the sole cause. Other factors like the stock market crash and the failure of banks also played a significant role. So what this is saying is basically, and what had stated previously, was the Great Depression already was happening before the tariffs were even put into place. And the primary and major factors to it, the primary factors to it, were stuff such as, but not limited to necessarily, the stock market crash and the failure of banks. And what they are kind of talking about, and most Americans should have learned this in history class at some point, was a huge amount of the populace basically discovering credit cards is basically the simplest way of putting it. So yeah. And so again, this is one sentence, or two sentences by AI Google. Debate on the role of tariffs. Some economists argue that the tariffs were a significant factor in the length and depth of the Depression, while others suggest they were a secondary factor. So basically, it's consistent, basically saying the tariffs did not cause it, but they caused it to be longer and to essentially put the Great in the Great Depression. Ongoing discussion. The role of tariffs in the Great Depression continues to be debated by economists and historians. So basically, it's still debate. People still debate whether any of this is true and accurate. And this is all, again, AI Google, AI overview, right? But it does pull from data and articles and sites and whatnot, such as Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So that's the general overview, hence AI, or the Google AI overview. But let's get into it even more because it's important, right? Did tariffs cause a Great Depression? Here's what to know. NPR. Which we all know, NPR typically leans towards anti-Trump. So, reading any of this, you need to have the mindset that this is going to want to, at the very least, veer towards anti-Trump. Anything that makes Trump look worse is how they are going to try to portray it as such. Generally. My apologies. I received a phone call and I had to take a break. But let's get back to it. So, President Trump's new tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China have unsettled both domestic and international markets concerning investors and manufacturers. Canada and China this week announced retaliatory measures after Trump long promised tariffs took effect. The tariffs included 25% levy on most imports from Canada and Mexico, with an additional 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports. Tariffs on Chinese goods have been increased from 10% to 20%. Okay, so bunch of tariffs across the board, kind of. Or not across the board, actually. Is a bunch of tariffs against Canada, Mexico, and China. And the tariffs were an additional 10% on Canadian exports, energy exports. So I guess that there was already a 15% tariff on it, and then tariffs on Chinese goods have been increased from 10% to 20%. Okay, so went up another 10%. And well, I mean, this was like a month ago almost. So, and we've seen what's happened since. But this kind of doesn't really matter too much, because what we're looking for is the history and how it affected the history in the Great Depression, right? So anyway, let's get to the Great Depression. There are fears that the tariffs could trigger an economic downturn reminiscent of the Great Depression, nearly a century ago. Posts on social media have claimed that tariffs caused the Great Depression. Oh, wow, exactly what I was talking about and what everybody has been seeing, right? Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Here's what to know about the Great Depression. Was it caused by tariffs? The Great Depression was a catastrophic economic downturn that began in October 1929 and lasted for nearly a decade. Wow. A decade of the Great Depression. Wow. I mean, we all know it was really bad. It was. It is considered one of the worst economic periods in history, with a peak unemployment rate. I think you would have to say American history, but anyway. With a peak unemployment rate that included an estimated 12,830,000 persons out of work in 1933 alone. So basically 13 million. 13 million people. That is a lot of people that lost jobs during that period and could not find other work. Other countries, including Germany and Britain, also suffered economic declines during this period. Okay. The U.S. has imposed tariffs on some imported goods since the late 1700s. The tariff caused a great, certainly not. Says Gary Richardson, an economics professor at the University of California, Irvine, and former historian of the Federal Reserve System. So, University of California, Irvine, economics professor, former historian of the Federal Reserve System. Certainly not. Which AI Google has basically said as well. So still consistent. And this is NPR, which is again going to be wanting to veer towards anything anti-Trump. Anything that puts Trump as bad, they want to do that, right? In the early 1900s, the U.S. government transitioned towards a free trade system and adopted federal income taxes in 1913, which helped reduce the government's dependency on tariffs. What Trump was talking about before. How does that actually matter? We haven't gone there yet. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is the primary act that everybody is talking about, named after Republicans Oregon Representative Willis Hawley and Utah Senator Reed Smoot, implemented high tariffs that reached nearly 60%. Again, a massive tariff, right? Massive tariff. But this act was not signed into law until June 17, 1930, months after the Great Depression had already started. So everything is consistent. But so what caused the Great Depression? So it did not cause the Great Depression. So what caused the Great Depression? A number of factors contributed to the Great Depression economics, tell NPR. During the 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, the economy was growing and the stock market was thriving. But the Federal Reserve, created in 1913, raised the discount rate, the interest rate charged to member banks borrowing money, explained Marcus, which are a assistant professor at economic history of West Virginia University. According to Witcher, as a result of the Federal Reserve's policy, the money supply contracted. This meant there was less money in circulation, making it more difficult for Americans to obtain credit, either for purchases or to start expand a business. This led to an economic decline that triggered the stock market crash in 1929 and caused more than 9,000 bank failures between 1929 and 1933. That is a lot of bank failures. So basically, what I'm getting from this, and consistent with what I learned in history class, Americans learned about credit cards, caused a huge issue, and then they had to somehow pay that money back at some point, right? That's how credit cards work, right? Anyway, not only did President Herbert Hoover sign this now, also I want to say, I don't actually know if credit cards were created at this time period. If I remember correctly, I believe in history class they actually said it was kind of largely due to like actually credit cards being developed and introduced, but I don't actually know if it's credit cards, but essentially it's the same idea. Not only did President Herbert Hoover sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law despite objections and economists during an allegedly fragile economic period. He also enacted the Revenue Act of 1932, which increased income tax rates from 25% to 63%. Another massive tax. Imagine having to pay over half your income to the government. Oh wow, it sounds like other governments are kind of currently, and people there are not very happy. I would not be very happy if over half my money was going to the U.S. government. Hoover increased the taxes because he thought it was important to balance the budget and saw tax increases as the only way to achieve that. Okay, and I will say, I think everybody agrees having a balanced budget in anything is important, and saw tax increases as the only way to achieve that. As a result, he didn't balance the budget and further disincentivized economic activity, which tells NPR. So basically, was not effective, did not balance the budget, and because you are paying over half your money, it did not stimulate economic activity. Wow, what a surprise. A combination of these factors resulted in a perfect economic storm, leading to a domino effect that exacerbated the economic crisis, says Christopher Clark, an economics professor at Washington State University, so another economics professor. The tariffs implemented under the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act worsened the Great Depression, Richardson, Clark, and Witcher say. So that everybody's consistent, they worsened it. These tariffs also strained relationships with the other countries beyond the realm of trade. So other countries were also very mad about us putting these massive tariffs on them. So basically everybody was being taxed. Americans were being taxed over half their money. Countries were being taxed, or companies were being taxed over half their money if they wanted to import stuff. So essentially, other countries were, in theory, taxed, although it doesn't actually quite work out like that, but whatever. Anyway, everybody's being taxed, nobody's happy, including other countries. Less trade leads to less cooperation and less trust, which will lead to more violence. Yeah, sure, true. Clark says, adding that strained international relations were contributing factors to World War II. True, very true. I mean, we all know about that. The impact of the latest tariffs on the economy remain uncertain, however. Okay, so this is no longer about the Great Depression? Is in a better position than it was during the Great Depression. While it's unlikely new tariffs will trigger. Oh, wow. While it's unlikely that the new tariffs will trigger depression, they could lead to an economic slowdown with higher prices resulting in consumers cutting back on spending, according to Clark, which are also how the tariffs can impact jobs. Okay, interesting. I actually did not read this because I was focused basically on the entirety of the Great Depression. Oh, is it possible that the Great Depression? So I didn't read this. I must have also missed this and how, yeah. But anyway, so the Great Depression was a singular event in our history, so I think it is unlikely that Trump's 25% tariffs lead to an economic calamity on that scale. Wow, I mean, yeah. But 25% tariffs will definitely make us poor, will not save many jobs, and will likely result in net job losses in related sectors. During his address on Congress on Tuesday, he said that more tariffs, including reciprocal tariffs, would go into effect next month on April 2nd. Oh, yeah. They certainly did. They certainly did. Whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them, he said. Whatever they tax us, we will tax them. If they do non-monetary tariffs to keep us out of the markets, then we will do non-monetary barriers to keep them out of our markets. Basically, everything is going to be reciprocal, is basically what he's trying to say. Or is what Trump says, which is just something they say. The tariffs being implemented by Trump are historically high, similar to tariffs imposed during the Great Depression, and tariffs could get higher, Richardson says, but the circumstances differ significantly, particularly regarding who is imposing them. Okay, so basically he's saying circumstances, not the same. Tariffs, extremely high, similar, because, I mean, there was extremely high tariffs, so it's similar. But circumstances, not the same, and significantly so. The tariffs of the 1930s were imposed by the U.S. Congress. Richardson says this is Trump's signature move, and he is personally going to bear probably almost all the blame if things go wrong. Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, yeah, and we're already seeing this. The economists did not provide any positive outcomes regarding tariffs. When economists put it, tariffs are like a game of chicken where each side waits to see who will back down first. When one country imposes tariffs, the other retaliates, creating a cycle of escalating measures. Yeah, that's what we learned in history class too, and it's generally pretty accurate of where countries don't generally like when a tariff is put on their stuff, so they retaliate, and that's pretty obvious and simple, and yeah, and we're seeing that happen with China right now. The people imposing tariffs first, which is in this case is the U.S., were kind of saying, yeah, we understand this could go really wrong and everyone could suffer, but we'd rather have everyone suffer than the current state of the world. So if you don't want everyone to suffer, if you don't want to suffer, you got to give it to us, Richardson says. Which in this case is the U.S. Yeah, so that's basically what we're saying. And this is what I'm going to go very briefly, because we're not there yet, but very briefly. So if you don't want everyone to suffer, if you don't want to suffer, you got to give in to us.
This is basically what the working class is saying. Almost like a class war.
Witcher, Richardson, and Clark all agree that the new tariffs could have negative implications for the economy. Any way you look at it, a 25% tariff is bad economic policy, Witcher says. There are very few winners and many, many losers from such a policy, combined with other factors such as declining consumer confidence, interest rate increases, etc., 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 etc. They could contribute to a recession. End of article. So basically, tariffs prevent growth, hurt economies in general. Generally not that good for economies. Okay. The higher the worse, and the higher the worse. Makes sense. But that was one article, one source. And now let's go ahead and look at other stuff. Give me 1 second. I will be right back. So, let's go ahead and look at some other stuff. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Because if you only use one source, you're probably going to not get a full picture. And when you do not get a full picture, you don't quite get an accurate answer. U.S. legislation that raised import duties to protect American businesses and farmers, adding considerable strain to international economic climate, the Great Depression, etc., blah, blah, blah. We already learned about all this. It was the last legislation under which U.S. Congress set actual tariff rates. Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that. Doesn't really matter, though. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised the United States already high tariff rates. So also there was already high tariff rates, which we already covered a little bit too. Anyway, continuing on. 1922, Congress had enacted in 1922, Congress had enacted the Forney-McCumber Act, which was among the most punitive protectionist tariffs passed in the country's history, raising the average import tax. What just happened to my mouse? Anyway, raising the average import tax to some 40%. So basically, this is what it was saying. Before even the Smoot-Hawley or the Hawley-Smoot Act, Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, there was already high tariffs. 40% tariff is a very high amount, right? All right, continuing on. Forney-McCumber tariff prompted retaliation from European governments, but did little to dampen U.S. prosperity. Throughout the 1920s, however, as European farmers recovered from World War I and their American counterparts faced intense competition, declining prices because of overproduction, U.S. agriculture interests lobbied the federal government for protection against agriculture imports. In his 1928 campaign for presidency, Republican candidate Herbert Hoover promised to increase tariffs on agricultural goods, but after he took office, lobbyists from other economic sectors encouraged him to support a broader increase. Although an increase in tariffs was supported by most Republicans, an effort to raise import duties failed in 1929, largely because of opposition from centrist Republicans in the U.S. Senate in response to the stock market crash in 1929. So basically, tariffs already high. There was, Europe retaliated, but it did very little to stop U.S. prosperity, U.S. economics prosperity and growth throughout the 1920s. But afterwards, throughout the 1920s, after farmers recovered from World War I, very significant detail, it caused American counterparts, it caused American farmers essentially to face intense competition and declining prices because of overproduction. So they also were overproducing on top of that. And again, remember, this is because of retaliation tariffs from the European governments. So basically, after World War I, they were not capable of producing enough food, so America was selling them food, and because they simply could not produce enough, they had to buy it from Americans, and so Americans could charge however much they wanted, pretty much, and meaning that even with tariffs on the food, they still had to buy it. But the U.S. put high tariffs and prevented food from any food that was actually being exported from Europe was basically not being bought by Americans. Okay. So this was allowing a lot of prosperity. In his 1928 for his presidency, already went over that. Although an increase of tariffs was supported by most Republicans. Okay, yeah, already went over this. In response to the stock market crash of 1929, however, protectionism gained strength, and through the tariff legislation subsequently passed only by a narrow margin, 44%. It easily passed. Did I misread this? I don't think so. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'm not reading this correctly. Although an increase in tariffs was an effort to raise import duties failed in 1901. Okay, so I guess it just got even, the sentiment got even stronger. Anyway, which would have led to the McKinley tariffs or the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Whatever. Okay. Anyway, protectionism gained strength, and through the tariff legislation subsequently it passed only by a narrow margin. Has easily House of Representatives for more than 1,000 economists urging him to veto the legislation, who were signed the bill into law in June 1917. June 17, 1930. Smoot-Hawley contributed to early loss of confidence in Washington and U.S. by raising the average tariff some 20%. It also prompted retaliation from foreign governments. Again, we've already gone over that, and many overseas banks began to fail. Okay, yeah. Because legislation set both specific and ad valorem tariff rates, i.e., or basically rates based on the value of the product, determining the precise percentage increasing in tariff levels is difficult and a subject of debate among economists. My mouth is not mouthing today. My tongue is not doing the tongue things. Anyway, within 2 years, some 24 countries adopted similar beggar thy neighbor duties, making worse an already beleaguered world economy and reducing global trade. So basically, economies around the world shrinking, as we've already kind of gone over, blah, blah, blah. U.S. imports from exports to Europe fell by some 2/3 between 1929 and 1932. Wow, that is significant. And it's basically what they were already saying. Economies were shrinking. In general, trade was going bye-bye to everybody. While overall global trade declined by a similar level, which is generally what tariffs end up doing. While overall global trade declined by similar levels in 4 years, that legislation is in effect. In 1934, Franklin D. Roosevelt, I was going to say Delano Roosevelt because that's his full name, but anyway, signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, reducing tariff laws and promoting trade liberalization and cooperation with foreign governments. Some observers have argued that the tariff, by deepening the Great Depression, may have contributed to the rise of political extremism, enabling leaders such as Hitler to increase political strength and gain power. Okay, so basically, tariffs stopped trade, caused global trade issues, and caused global economic issues that was already affecting issues that contributed to affecting issues that were caused by World War One, but so contributing, not causing, but contributing to issues that were caused by World War One, essentially. And signed reducing tariff laws and promoting trade levels. Something that the tariff by deepening the Great Depression may have contributed to the rise of political extremism. Okay, so I don't quite understand how this plays into it necessarily. Like, this is definitely played into Hitler's rise, but I don't understand how this is playing specifically into the Great Depression. I believe people generally agree that his policies lengthened the Great Depression, which is interesting because it's like the exact opposite, and people were saying that. The other side, that exact opposite, contributed significantly, basically put the Great Depression and increased the length of it. What is going on with my mouse? Anyway. So it's interesting. I think it's interesting what I think this is saying. It's a little hard to understand. It is, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's saying. All right. Oh, wait, there is more. Okay, well, I'm going to take a short intermission. Okay, I'm back. Let's continue. 1934, yeah, I did this. Oh wait, this is a different article anyway. But I mean, it's relative economic history, the timing and severity. Let's see, anything new? Another friends with stop declining. Soon not agreement. Excuse me. So this is more about foreign stuff. But after mid-1930s, it grew more rapidly than in the mid-1930s. The U.S. recovery began in the spring of 1933. Output grew rapidly in the mid-1930s. Real GDP rose at an average rate of 9% per year between 1933 and 1930%. It had fallen so deeply in the early years of the 1930s, however, that it remained subsequently substantially below its long-run trend path throughout this period. In 1937 through 1938, the United States suffered another severe downturn, but after mid-1938, the American economy grew even more rapidly than in the mid-1930s. So basically, this is actually very related to the issue. So basically, Great Depression, basically a crash and Great Depression started to recover, became very fast in recovery, but because of such a great crash and downturn, still below. And then grew even faster, and real GDP rose at an average. And then, okay, so that's what I was saying. However, that remains substantially below exactly what I was saying. And then in 1937, 1938, because of how fast it was growing, small correction, basically is what I'm reading from this. Or not small, but another correction is basically what I'm reading from this. And then after that, it was stabilized and grew even faster. The country's output finally returned to its long-run trend path in 1942. Okay. And recovering the rest of the world very greatly. This is foreign stuff. Stopped declining, but yeah, I mean, I don't know about tariffs and stuff like that in relation to all this, so like I'm not going to pay attention to it. Causes of the decline. This is a different article, but I mean, it's all still related and whatnot. And this is kind of a good article too. Was decline in spending, which led to a decline in production and manufacturers, and it then rises the inventories. Okay, that's actually something to think. That's actually something that you have to keep in mind too. It's actually what's happening in China right now a bit too. The sources of the contraction in spending in the United States varied over the course of the Depression, but they accumulated in a monumental decline in aggregate demand. The American decline was transmitted to the rest of the world, largely through the gold standard, which I'm not going to pretend I exactly really know what the gold standard is. I imagine, because I'm basically guessing, it's just that the U.S. dollar was based off of gold that was kept in the Federal Reserve. That's that's a largely guessing and with a very little educated guessing. So I could be completely wrong, essentially. I don't know. However, a variety of other factors also influenced the downturn in various countries. Stock market crash, yeah, we already went over this. Some scholars believe that boom in housing construction in mid-1920s led to an excess supply of housing, and particularly large drop in construction in 1928 to 1929. Okay, so this is probably pretty related, or pretty important to read. So let's go over it then. I am trying to keep this at least somewhat concise for you guys because, I mean, I'm young. I know. My attention span is all. Why do you think I had to take an intermission? Anyway, let's keep going. The initial decline in U.S. output in the summer of 1929 is widely believed to have stemmed from tight U.S. monetary policies and limiting stock market speculation. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Actually, that's a bit of interesting. 1920s has been a prosperous decade, but not an exceptional. Also, keep in mind, this is Britannica, which I don't actually know much. I've seen it, I've used it before. I imagine most people have. I don't actually know if it really goes either way, to be honest. It might not. I don't know. Anyway, let's continue on. 1920s has been a prosperous decade, but not an exceptional boom period. Prices had remained nearly consistent throughout the decade, and there have been mild recessions in both 1924 and 1927. The one obvious area of excess was the stock market. Stock prices had risen more than 4 times from the low in 1921 to the peak in 1929. In 1928 and 1929, the Federal Reserve had raise interest rates in hopes of slowing the rapid rise in stock prices. These higher interest rates depressed interest-sensitive spending in areas such as construction and automobile purchases, which in turn reduced production. So basically, stock market just absolute boom. Other stuff, not so much, but stock market absolute boom. My guess is probably because more globalization of trade and more, not just your rich Americans participating in it, but all Americans, and not even just Americans, because it's globalizing, participating in it. So just an absolute boom. That's my guess. I don't actually know, but that's what I'm reading from this. In 1928 and 1929, had raised interest rates. So and then the Fed came in and decided to tax all that because they were concerned about it. I don't even know why they did that. This is history, so I generally think it's also, unless if it's very blatant that it's propaganda or misstrued and whatnot, I generally think that these companies are not quite being inauthentic, just simply because if they want any legitimacy whatsoever in it when it comes to history. People can look up stuff and whatnot, and which is what I'm doing, right? Anyway, sorry, I get distracted. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Some scholars believe that booming housing construction in the mid-1920s led to an excess supply of housing, in particular in 1920, 1929. So I'm getting from this a large part of like the stock market boom and stuff like that was housing stocks and stuff like that, and so then added the taxing plus housing market plus the housing market being a huge thing of it, and then losing it, complete crash. That's what I'm reading from this. Could I be wrong? Could I be entirely wrong? Yeah, I could be. I don't know, but that's what I'm reading from this. I'm trying to. Yeah. Anyway. By fall of 1929, U.S. stock prices reached levels that cannot be justified by reasonable anticipated of the future. As a result of a variety of minor events led to gradual price declines in October 1929. Investors lost confidence and the stock market bubble burst. Right, so absolute crash. Panic selling began on Black Thursday, October 24, 1929. Many stocks have been purchased on market, that is, using loans secured by only a small fraction of the stock's value. As a result, the prices declined, forced some investors to liquidate their holdings, thus exacerbating the fall in prices. This is kind of what I was talking about, the credit stuff. So I guess it wasn't credit. I guess that it wasn't that Americans discovered actual credit cards, but like they did discover credit essentially, and this is what this is saying basically. Between the peak in September and their low in November, U.S. stock prices measured by Kohl's index declined 33% because the decline was so dramatic. This event is often referred to as the Great Crash of 1929, pretty much causing Great Depression, or largely causing the Great Depression. Stock market crash reduced American spending substantially. Consumer purchase of durable goods and investments fell sharper than the crash. People panicked, stopped buying more, causing more money to not be circulating, causing even more people, causing an even greater effect, causing as well as even more people and things affected, meaning businesses. So yeah, a likely explanation of the financial and if. We did learn about that in history class. So, a likely explanation is that the financial crisis created considerable uncertainty. This was just saying. Yeah, this is what I just said. Although the losses of wealth was relatively small, the crash may also have depressed spending by making people feel poor. What I was saying, people panicked. What I was saying. As a result of the drastic spending, which has been declining slowly up to this point, what I was saying. People panicked, less money circulating in general, causing more people, causing greater effects, and more people to be and things to be affected. That's why the Great Crash decline. Okay. Wait, hang on. That last part. The decline in stock market also was one factor contributing to declines in production and employment in the United States. Very important for later on. Next, okay, so this is a really freaking good article. And the funniest part is it wasn't even the article that I clicked on. Interesting. Let's get sources real fast. Written by Richard H. Pels, Christine D. Romer, all fact-checked by editors of Encyclopedia. Okay. So if you want, you can look up these people, try to verify legitimacy. I think that this website is generally more informative. It is more neutral and informative in general. I don't know. Because, I mean, it's a big website. People know of it and stuff. People have used it at least once or so. Anyway, grid timing is very good. Wait, is this... Where was I? Okay, yeah, it's down here. Just see. banking. Okay, so this is where it's at. The next blow to aggregate spend and demand occurred in the fall of 1930 when the first of all waves of banking and exports to the United States. A banking panic rises when many depositors simultaneously lose confidence in the solvency of banks and demand their bank deposits be paid them in cash. Basically, what the above thing was saying and what I was saying and whatnot. Panicking, people keeping their money, less circulating, banks collapsing, causing banks to collapse, and investors collapse, blah, 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 blah. Everything worse, more, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. Still talking about that by their nature, being largely okay, yeah. Hang on. Economic historians believe that substantial increases in farm debt in 1920s, together with U.S. policies that encouraged small, undiversified banks, created an environment in which such panics could ignite and spread. So basically, banks were also too small. Because there was no real centralization of banks at that time and stuff like that. So basically, no extremely large banks. Banks were too small to be able to withstand the panic and everything, and it caused even greater. It was just another snowball effect, which we did learn about this in history class too, if you were paying attention. But yeah, so that's basically what that's saying. The heavy farm debt stemmed in part from the high price of has very expensive borrowing, wishing to. Okay, so basically, because everything was so beneficial, because farmers were making so much money, because of World War One, essentially, they decided, and because Americans had discovered credit, basically, and whatnot, they decided to use that to try to make even more money. And so they were in debt, and then the market crashed and everything crashed, leaving them in an even worse position, causing even worse repercussions in general. Okay. The very lowest. This is a really freaking good article. Economic. Very low to try to stem the banking panics. Economists Milton Friedman, very important economist actually, and Anna J. Schwartz, another very important one, in a classic study in monetary history of the United States, 1867-1960, argued that the death in 1928 of Benjamin Strong, I don't know who that is, who had been the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York since 1914, was a significant cause of this inaction. Interesting. That is very interesting. I don't exactly know how that plays into it, but basically what these guys were saying, who are very important economists, were saying is that due to this guy's death, the Fed was even more ineffective, inefficient, stuff like that, I think, and which led to more inaction, so interesting. Oh wait, they might expand right now. Strong had been a forceful leader who understood the ability of the central bank to limit panics. His death left a power vacuum at the Federal Reserve, and a lot of leaders with less sensible views to block ineffective. Yeah, so basically, I was just assuming the panics caused a dramatic rise in the amount of currency people wish to hold relative to the bank. Yeah, so this was part of what contributed to essentially the panic and stuff and all kinds of stuff. Okay. In September 1991, Bruno was feared that the United States would devalue as well. I mean, I get less foreign money going around, less money going around globally is basically, I think, what that's saying. Which we already kind of covered a bit in what this article even covered a bit. So yeah, it's believed that such declines in the money supply caused by Federal Reserve is not blah 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 blah. A simple picture provides simply perhaps the clearest evidence of the key role blah 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 Blah, 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 blah. Okay, gold standard. I don't know what. So just gonna explain what gold standard causes. Each country set the value of its currency in terms of each country set the value of its currency in terms of gold and took monetary actions to defend the fixed price. So I think that's what I was saying, and kind of assuming that there was this gold stockpiles that countries based their currency off of. It is possible that the Reserve expanded the money supply greatly in response to banking practices. Foreigners would have lost confidence. This could have led to large gold outflows in the United States, but could have been forced to revalue. Okay, so I think that what this is saying is like because people were panicking, taking out their money from the banks, blah blah blah, trying to keep it to themselves, because it was based on gold. It means that like taking you like if you took money to the bank and it was like, hey, I want my gold, they had to give you the gold, right? And I think that's basically what it's saying. And there wasn't enough gold essentially, and it caused even more people to panic and try to take out even more before it was too late. Blah 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 blah. We did actually kind of learn about this in history. I did forget about it, but I do remember learning about this. So, okay. Likewise, the Federal Reserve not tying the money, but next is possible that there would have been speculative time done. Yes, could have been forced to ban and while there's debate about the rollout of played limited use, mostly there is no question that was a key factor in the transmission of America's economic decline to the rest of the world. Okay, so basically U.S. or Britain was, I guess that they were part of the American gold standard? Or was it that Britain had just the same setup, but I mean, same issues over there, and so they compounded each other? I think it's either one of those. I can't quite tell from this article. But it seems to be one of those two. Either way, either way, regardless of which scenario it is, still compounded the issue. Undergo same message trader as the fall gave rise to international gold and intense international demand for American assets such as stocks and bonds, brought large inflows of gold to the United States. The decision by France after World War I to return to the gold standard with no valid front. Undeveloped frontage led to trade surpluses. This is too complex for me. Don't quite understand what it's saying. But basically, I think just what I kind of getting from it, basically more people going to the gold standard, causing gold to be even more causing an even more why can I not think of the word right now? Causing even less gold to be available in general worldwide, so just basically more of what, just causing more of the issue, essentially. Okay. Of the countries and blah 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 blah. Okay. Oh wow, this is a lot of words. International lending and trade. Okay, so basically, tariffs did not contribute. Tariffs did not contributed to a large amount to global trade issues. But certainly did not cause the global trade issues either. Those trade issues were compounded with a bunch of other stuff too. Okay, that's hence Great Depression. Without the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, possibly could have taken out the Great, but still would have been a pretty big depression. Okay, that's basically what I'm getting from all this. Some new deals may have actually hindered recovery. What people were saying. Did I miss? Did I miss? Did I skip too much? Did I skip too much? Some blah 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 devaluation blah 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 blah. The American money supply increased nearly sanitary extraction, gold flow inflow to because WC seemingly monetary expansion seemingly spending by just also created expectation of inflation rather than deflation. Okay, so I think maybe like people like because there was not enough gold to go around, they had to devalue the amount a single dollar actually meant. I think is basically what this is saying, which kind of leads to inflation. Yeah, I think that's basically what this is saying. Fiscal policy played a relatively small role in stimulating recovery in the United States, and neither Revenue Act and English tax rates attempt to balance the federal budget by doing so. The contrary new deal initiated in 1930 did include a number of federal programs generating recovery hired them employed to work on government building projects in Tennessee Valley Authority, constructed dams and power plants in particularly depressed areas. However, the actual increase in government spending and government budget deficit were small relative to the size of the economy. This is especially apparent when state government budget deficits were included because those deficits actually declined at the same time that the federal deficit rose. As a result, the new spending programs initiated have little direct expansion effect. Okay, so basically, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR comes in, says, "Hey, we're going to start pumping money into, and so that way we can get people, we can provide jobs for workers." And however, the increase in government spending and the government budget deficit were small relative to the size of the economy. This is especially apparent when state government budget deficits were included because those deficits actually declined at the same time that the federal deficit rose. So, especially apparent. So, because those deficits were actually declined at the same time that the federal. Okay. But basically, because even though he was spending so much money to get people working again and stuff like that, it coincided with states' deficits reducing, so somewhat equal. As a result, the newspaper program initiative have really expansion on the economy. So I think it's saying didn't really have much effect on like the actual inflation and stuff like that. Whether they may nonetheless had positive effects on consumers and businesses, sentiment reading, but people had jobs and stuff is basically what I think that's saying. So some new deal program may have actually hindered recovery. Then set up the national recovery, which encouraged firms in each industry to adopt a code of behavior. These codes to disclose competition between firms. Some minimum. Okay, so more government oversight, basically. And basically getting rid of competition is kind of what it's saying. So minimum wages in each industry and sometimes limited production. Likewise, adjustment. Well, heavily regulated competition, but AAA, which voluntary guidelines restrict production, blah blah. Which voluntary guidelines gave incentive payments to farmers to restrict production in hopes of raising agriculture. Okay, so
basically tried to get them to farm less basically they can get paid for farming less. Okay. Our research has such anti-competitive practices in wage and they led to inflation in the early recovery business and discouraged employment and production. That's a little bit interesting. But I guess basically inefficient businesses still inefficient and kind of almost bailed out in a sense. But those issues were still there. I don't quite think I'm understanding this correctly. If you somehow managed to watch this and get to this point, please help me understand this a little bit better. I would very much appreciate it. Recovering was stopped short by another distinct recession. Yeah, we already went over this. Blah blah. Okay, so a lot of information. Fiscal contraction, decrease in inventory investment led to labor unrest, are also thought to have contributed to the downturn that the United States experienced in the second. It's a second very severe contraction before it had completely recovered from there. Yeah, we kind of went over that. Yeah. World War II played only a modest role in recovering the dismantled recession. Therefore, and by okay, actually, it seems applicable. Despite the recession, the real GDP in the nation was well above its pre-depression level by 1939. Okay, and by 1941, it had recovered to within about 10% of its long-run trend path there. For in a fundamental sense, the United States had largely recovered before military spending accelerated noticeably for World War II. They're talking about the Lend-Lease and stuff like that. At the same time, U.S. economy was still somewhat below trend, and the unemployment rate averaged just under 10% in 1941. So basically, what I'm getting from this is that the government started pumping money back into the businesses and stuff like that. To try to prevent competitiveness and try to establish minimum wages and stuff like that, which is not necessarily whatever. Anyway, but because of this, the businesses took advantage of it and just kind of kept it at minimum wage. If they could have afforded higher, is my guess. That's my guess. And then because they were getting money for not trying to compete, and they were just pocketing it. They were essentially pocketing a lot of money from the government. Is basically what I'm getting from this. And it didn't go down to the workers. It largely didn't go down to the workers. Some of it did, but not all of it. Not as much as the hope was, essentially. But production was higher. So while the war was not the main impetus for the economy, but the economy was higher. The economy was even stronger. It's just that the workers might not necessarily been getting it particularly. So while the war was not the main impetus for recovering, they played a role in completing the return to full employment because they needed workers for Lend-Lease and stuff like that. Yeah. The role of fiscal expansion. This is a really freaking good article, dude. Jeez. It's long. It's extremely long. This is a complete essay, dude. But it's actually really good. The most devastating impact was human suffering in a short period of time. World output percentage of the living dropped precipitously. As much as 1/4 of the labor force in industrialized countries was unable to find work in the early 1930s. So 25% unemployment, basically. While conditions began to improve by the mid-1930s. Total recovery was not accomplished until the end of the decade. It took time. Sure. Makes sense. Great Depression and policy response also changed the world economy in crucial ways. Most obviously, it hastened, if not caused, the end of the international gold standard. Okay. Although a system of fixed currency exchange rates was reinstated after World War II under Bretton Woods system, the economies of the world never embraced that system with the conviction and fervor they had bought to the gold standard. Okay, so basically, gold no longer based off of gold, but they tried to keep it similar to it without any actual thing. By 1973, fixed exchange rate had been abandoned in favor of floating rates. Okay, I think that's just talking about the same thing. Both labor unions and welfare state expanded substantially during the 1930s. In the United States, union membership more than doubled between 1930 and 1940. This trend was stimulated by both the severe unemployment in the 1930s and the passage of the National Labor Regulations Wagner Act 1935, which encouraged collective bargaining. Okay, so really supported unions. The United States also established unemployment compensation and old age and survivorship through the Social Security Act. Right. We all learned about this. FDR was the father of it. Yeah, we did learn about that. Which was passed in response to the hardships of the 1930s. It is uncertain whether these changes would have eventually occurred in the United States without the Great Depression. It probably would have at some point. Many European countries had experienced significant increases in union membership and had established government pensions before the 1930s. Both of these trends, however, accelerated in Europe during the Great Depression. So, okay, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah. Actually, hang on. Many countries government regulation, economy, blah. Established deposit. Okay, the Banking Act of 1933, also known as Glass-Steagall Act, established deposit insurance in the United States and prohibited banks from underwriting or dealing in securities. Actually a pretty important act. What I'm reading from it basically strengthened a centralized banking system. Which at the time was necessary at the least. Deposit insurance, which did not become common worldwide until after World War II, effectively eliminated banking panics as an exacerbated factor in recession in the United States after 1933. Okay, yeah. Also play development, macroeconomic policies, blah blah blah. Blah, culture and society and Great Depression. Okay, this might be interesting. No case I was more terrified for people threatened rather than in the 1930s. From others I can include an economic disorder, rise of totalitarianism, Hitler, and the coming or presence of war. Now, last decade is remembered in different ways in different parts of the world. For people in Iceland, that was indelibly the age of Great Depression, making impact, destroyed faith in economic sense, all but limited faith in the future. The worst drought in American modern history struck the Rust Belt and everything. Yeah, we learned about this. Which was very unfortunate timing. Very unfortunate timing. The windstorm stripped the topsoil from the edge, blah, 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 blah. Or not the Rust Bowl, Dust Bowl, yeah. Anyway. As a result, some 2.5 blah, blah, yeah. For Americans, we'll always summon up images of bread lines, apple sellers on the street. Yeah, this is true. Yep, true. Hoovervilles, yeah. Blah blah blah, we're homeless, blah 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 blah. It was a time when the number of women in the workplace actually increased, which helped needy families, but only added to the psychological strain on the American male. Oh wow, something that sounds a little familiar. Traditional breadwinner of the American family was a time when one of the most popular times was brother, can you spare a dime? I don't know how the tune goes, but yeah. Global concerns. Yeah, and this is talking about World War II and stuff. Blah blah blah. Blah blah blah. Blah 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 blah. Blah 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 blah. Okay, yeah, I think that's about it. Wait, hang on. Moments on social change. This might be applicable. Sorry, the mouse was kind of acting up again. I don't know why my mouse is doing it. Maybe I have too many tabs. Oh, my bad. Maybe I have too many tabs. Maybe. Huh. I don't know. Yeah, anyway, on topic. Social and civil was the gravest. Blah blah blah. At least it's blah blah blah. Yeah. This was an undeniable extraordinary political event. Yeah. There's also a time when significant inspired by Marxist movements and ideas, as well as with the notion that the model for a more humane society could be found in the Soviet Union. Above all, was a decade of cultural ferment in which American writers, artists, and cultural experimented with new, more social-oriented forms of literature, painted, theater, music, and blah blah. Yeah.
Huey Long, every man a king.
Yet paradoxes well, a teacher not to be a predominantly conservative and people the near mythical common man who suffered in okay. By contrast, what they considered the pointless carnival war and has shown little interest oh, this is actually fair. Oh, wow. Okay, nor do they display much affection for life in the United States, and the most American novelists, poets, artists, composers, and scientists continue to believe, as they had since the 19th century, that the United States was culturally inferior to Europe, so to learn the latest modernist techniques in literature, painting, or music, or to study the most advanced theories in physical and mathematical science, they assumed they had to go to London. Wow, this is Anyway. Rise the scene to explain pervasive the cause of capitalism's collapse, while also providing a vision of alternative social and inside of the person's communist appear to be a concrete embodiment of what many writers called in characters of communicators the socialist experiment. In addition, for 94 was the most uncompromising yes. Wait, what is that about the Spanish? Spanish Civil War, right? Appeal Marxism led up 53 prominent Americans. Yeah. Blah blah blah. Blah blah blah. Okay, I think we're actually getting to the point of where I can finally move on. Increasing American increasing blah 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 okay, cool. Okay, I think I'm good. All right, finally, can move on. Holy. Okay, so that's a lot of what led, a lot of the history of the Great Depression. So basically, though, answer in short terms is tariffs. Not exactly the cause. Certainly a factor. Not even as possibly not even the largest factor. Okay, so then finally I can move on. Wow, that was long. I'm sure I'm gonna edit out a lot of it. Okay, now I have to get my bearings back. Guess yeah. Okay. So now what I started wondering is basically, did the tariffs, so the tariffs hurt global trade, but before that, what was the circumstances before that? So Great Depression started in 1929, Herbert Hoover. So did Herbert, let's go back over a bit. History of tariffs. So let's go ahead and look at tariffs more directly. This is Wikipedia. Everybody all know Wikipedia generally fairly accurate. There's certainly issues with it and whatnot, and it tends, and even though it's not really supposed to, it does tend to lean towards leftist things. Whatever, don't really care that much. Anyway, this is also history, so it's you kind of look back and we just did a lot of that, right? All right, so cool. Politics of protection. The iron and steel industry and the wool industry were the well-organized interest groups that demanded, and it's kind of hard to find like specific tariff numbers and stuff like that. I had looked for like a few hours before and stuff like that, and it's pretty hard to find like the actual numbers. I'm sure people better at finding that stuff and whatnot can find it. I mean, if you see this, if you manage to stay with me this far and you're seeing this and you know these numbers, or at least how to find them or whatever, I would very much appreciate you putting them down there for me, so that way I can have even more information to look at, because information will lead you to, because the more information you have, the better an understanding you have. All right. But you do also want to try to be as accurate and objective as possible. All right. Anyway. Were well-organized interest groups that demanded and usually obtained high tariffs through supported industrial workers had much higher wages. So this is the part that's important. This part is very important to me. Industrial workers had much higher wages than their European counterparts, and they credited to the tariff and voted Republican. So basically, big tariffs effective in getting higher wages for Americans, while still being able to actually have, while the companies still actually being able to have competitive pricing. Okay. But some of this, this was like in the late 1800s, so this was even before the World War I. So there you go. There's that to consider. The iron and steel industry and the wool industry were the one. Oh wait, I just went over this. Yeah. Okay. Democrats were divided on the issue in large part because of pro-tariff elements in the Pennsylvania Party who wanted to protect the growing iron industry as well as pockets of fat. So in iron industry also the growing iron industry. That's also an important thing to as well as pockets of high tariff support in nearby industrializing states. Okay, so not just Pennsylvania, but growing iron industry in the U.S. in general. It coincided with high tariffs. However, President Grover clearly made low tariffs the centerpiece of Democratic policy in the late 1880s. His argument is that high tariffs were an unnecessary. So this was all before 1880s, essentially. Like all this was before 1880s, basically. His argument is that high tariffs were an unnecessary and unfair tax on consumers. The South and West generally supported low tariffs, and the industrial East support high tariffs. Republican William McKinley was the outstanding spokesman for high tariffs, promising it would bring prosperity for all groups. Okay, so basically, then in the 1880s, Grover Cleveland said high tariffs not good, and was unfair tax on Americans, and that they were unnecessary too, and because of that, were unfair tax on Americans. That's basically what he was saying. Interesting. After Civil War, high tariffs remained as the Republican Party remained as the Republican remained in office, and the Southern Democrats were restricted from office. Advocates insisted that tariffs brought prosperity to the nation as a whole, and none necessarily proceeded apace as okay. Advocates insisted that tariffs brought prosperity to the nation as a whole, and no one was really injured. As industrial proceeded apace, so coinciding with high tariffs throughout the Northeast, some Democrats, especially Pennsylvanians, became high tariff advocates. So they were still very much for high tariffs, and this was all coinciding with industrialization. Very important. Farmers and broke down high tariffs. Advocates appealed to farmers with a theme that high-wage factory workers would pay premium prices for foodstuff. So basically, farmers not particularly for it, which we had we'd already gone over a little bit, but high tariff people and basically on steel and stuff were saying, hey, it's fine. You just increase your price and people will be more than happy to pay your higher price because it's still going to benefit them overall. This was a home market idea and it won over most farmers, but it had little relevance to the South and Western farmers who exported most of the cotton, tobacco, and wheat. So basically, it didn't really quite work out though because farmers were making money more so from exporting than selling local and domestic. So you have to keep that in mind. It did not really help them, but you can also say, well, a large part of that is because they weren't even selling domestic. So keep that in mind. In the late 1860s, basically what this is saying, from what I'm reading, is like they knew that there would be like retaliation tariffs and stuff like that because, as we already went over, that kind of happened. That kind of tends to be the status. I was going to say status quo, but I'm not even sure that's the correct way of putting it. But that tends to be the norm, that there will always be retaliation tariffs, blah, blah, blah. And so they were expecting it to hit these, and it probably did. I don't know. I might look at the numbers. I'm not sure. That I was not expecting to be on that first article for so freaking long. My attention span is a Zoomer attention span, and I am amazed I've even made it this far. So we'll see. In the late 1860s, the wool manufacturers formed the First National Lobby and cut deals with wool farmers in several states. The challenge was that wool producers in Britain and Australia marketed a higher quality fleece than Americans, and that British manufacturer had costs as low as American mills. Okay, so basically they produced better stuff at the same cost. So who would buy American? And so because of that, where is it? And so because of that, wool manufacturers based near blah, 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 formed the First National Law and cut deals with wool growing farmers in several states so that way they could have competitive prices. Okay, interesting. I'm not quite sure how that applies to tariffs. So there's a wool tariff. Okay, so and that was supported by wool tariff, I guess. I think really what it's saying though is really like they just made a deal with wool farmers that they'll pay more if they support a wool tariff. Is basically what I think it really means. A tariff that means they have to pay together with high tariff on finished wool. Okay. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how effective that was. Well, actually, let's keep going because it might somewhat answer it on its own. I'm hoping it does. Apart from something, because I don't want to go on another hour-long article. Holy cow, that article was so freaking long, dude. Apart from one, had most American industry as it took lead, blah 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 blah. So demanded the high tariff be maintained. Blah 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 blah. Okay, this is what I was trying to get to. To the extent tariffs raised steel prices, they paid much more, making possible the U.S. steel industry's massive investment into to expand capacity and switch to the Bessemer process and later to the open hearth process. So basically more technological innovation that allowed for even cheaper steel, essentially. That allowed for more efficient production of steel, essentially. But between 1867 and 1900, the U.S. steel increased from 500 times increased more than 500 times from 22,000 tons to 11,400,000 tons. That is such a huge increase. And Bessemer steel rails first made the U.S. that would last 18 years under heavy traffic, which would come to replace the old raw iron rail that could only endure 2 years under that service. So better still too. So more efficient in producing and better still. Yeah, better process, much better process essentially is what it's saying. In 1881. Okay, so in 1881, British steel rails sold for $31 a ton, and Americans imported them. They paid a 28-ton tariff, giving $59 a ton for an imported ton of rails. American mills charged $61 and made a good profit, which was then reinvested into increased capacity, higher quality steels, higher wages, and benefits, and more efficient production. So basically, you see what I'm getting from it. British had much more efficient ways of innovation and methods of producing steel that caused it to be able to be produced at the same quality or better, even possibly for cheaper even. And because Americans did not have that innovation and efficiency and whatnot, and they need to catch up, they slapped a tariff on that allowed their steel to be competitive for a time, that allowed them to increased capacity, higher quality steels, whatever benefits, and more efficient production. So that allowed them to invest and catch up, essentially. But it was a short-term thing. By 1897, American steel rail price had dropped to $19.60 per ton compared to British steel at $21. So now it was even cheaper. So now they were even better at it than the British were at their own game, essentially. not including demonstrating that the tariff had performed its purpose of giving the industry time to become competitive, and that's what's saying. Very important. Very, very important. U.S. became an export still during blah 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 blah. Yeah, that's all like blah, blah. Okay, cool. How accurate is this? It's probably pretty accurate. This is, I mean, I can go and look this up, but I'm not going to simply because I kind of deem it to be probably pretty accurate. Just for the reasons I've said before. And that article kind of killed me. Cleveland Democrat redefined the issue in 18 with his attack on tariffs and inherently corrupt. We already kind of went over this. Blah 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 blah. There is a guarantee that yeah. Since the full enjoyment of all fruits of his industry. So basically what he's saying is like it's unfair, it makes it harder for newer business owners, for newer people to get into the business, blah blah blah. I think that's what this is saying. I think it is saying that this charge on minimum tax is independent of extortion, as well as it's just straight up unfair to the American consumer. The election of 18 was fought primarily over the tariff issue, including the laws. Okay. Let me make sure that I read that complete, or that, let me reread that just because I want to make sure that I interpret that correctly, at least for me, of where he also felt it decreased competition. With his science attack on terrorists as inherently corrupt, opposed to republicanism, and inefficient to boot. I think that's kind of, when we consider that the theory of of our institutional guarantees to every citizen the full enjoyment of all fruits of his industry and enterprise, it is plain that the extraction of more than minimum taxes is... Yeah, I think that's basically what he's trying to say. As well as it's just unfair to the American consumers that end up paying for products. Free foreign trade gives our money, our manufacturing markets. So this is a quote of his, I guess. Yeah, markets in other ways to the injury of our labor. Like, free foreign trade gives our money and manufacturers in our markets to other nations to the injury of our labor. This is not a Cleveland quote, is it? All trades being offered. Protection keeps money markets at home for the benefit of our own people. Yeah, this cannot... there's no way this is a Cleveland. This must be a McKinley quote, I think. Domestic campaign energetically against McKinley tariff in 1890 and scored sweeping gains. They're sucking blah 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 blah. So this is also, keep in mind, this is like 30-ish years before the Great Depression that these anti-tariffs policies and stuff were coming in. Cleveland and pro-business bourbon Democrats much lower tariff. His problem is that I already went over that. McKinley wanted arguing that high tariffs as a positive solution, because remember there was a depression before that too as well. So this must have been like during it. In 1897, the Republicans rushed to the based on rates back to 50% levels, massive tariffs. Democrats responded that the created government-sponsored trusts, some monopolies, and led to higher consumer prices. McKinley won re-election by an even bigger landslide and started talking about a post-tariff era of reciprocal trade agreements. So basically, he actually was even for free trade. He just felt that you had to stimulate growth, is what I'm getting from this. Like, you had to make sure that trade was fair, international trade was fair and reciprocal, and on top of that, you need to make sure that your industry was was already developed. Is basically what he was saying. Is what I'm getting from this. Reciprocity. Yeah, why can't I not say this word? I think that article freaking just slaughtered my brain, dude. Anyway, reciprocity, screw it. You know what? Let's just move on. Went nowhere. McKinley's vision was a half century too early. Okay, and we did end up doing this eventually. But and he wasn't even necessarily for free trade. He just wanted fair trade. He just wanted He wanted the global free trade, essentially. Global reciprocal free trade. The Republicans ended up paying ultra tariff of 1909. Republican President Theodore Roosevelt and I saw the tariff, so he put plenty of consideration of it. So basically, he couldn't make a decision and just passed it along. No good balance, but flew under the liberal hat to keep maybe for tariff reform, which I assume meant lower rates. So they wanted lower tariffs, lowered rates. With the pain bill, then sent to the Senate, where Nelson mobilization mobilized high rate senators. Okay, so Taft came in and lowered tariffs. Let's just make sure on that because I'm not entirely sure. Taft lower tariffs. Passed by Galton. Tariffs sharply lowered it. Landslide making withdrawal. The result wasn't a matter. Yeah. Passed by U.S. under presidency. Okay, let's take a look at this one because this seems accurate. This seems to the point and accurate. Tariff. In the 19th became a lot of road who wanted lower tariffs on goods. Yeah, okay, so lower tariffs. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. I'm skeptical of everything. I like verification of everything. By 1913, with the new income generating revenue, the Democrats with the Underwood tariff, so even lower tariffs. Outbreak of war in 1914 made the impact of tariffs of much less important. Yeah, I mean, I too would be less concerned about tariffs specifically and more concerned about the greatest war. It's gonna be the greatest war. Nobody does wars like me. I mean, it's unfortunate that Trump is blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's not the focus of this. When Republicans returned to power, they returned rates to a high level in Okay, so when Republicans returned to power, higher tariffs again. Next raise came with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, up to 60% tariffs. Okay, so 1930, after the start, however you want to characterize it. Okay. Tariff with Canada. So based off of all this, what all I had questioned beforehand, even before finding that really good article, was what my real question started becoming was, okay, was the Great Depression inevitable, essentially? And did these tariffs possibly even help preemptively help reduce how bad the Great Depression was going to be? And what the other article was saying and whatnot was that the Great Depression was so bad, people were looking at communism and stuff like that, because and like looking at is capitalism just a failed policy? Like, it was that bad. And so my question is, did these tariffs preemptively reduce it to a level of where that didn't happen? That's my question. Like, and are people misunderstanding basically the actual impact of them and whatnot? Because, and what I mean by that is, did they allow for enough protection of whatever was left of the industries to before the actual stock markets collapsed and whatnot, to where there was enough of the industries left that it, even though it was extremely bad, it was greatly bad. It was the Great Depression. Did it prevent the entire depression? Did it prevent the ultimate depression, essentially, is my question. Because that's what I kind of interpret from all this, to be honest. And that's why I'm making this video. And so anyway, let's keep going. Or a big reason why I'm making a video. Yeah, I mean, the Smoot-Hawley tariff is kind of like the main thing that people are talking about and stuff like that, and is the infamous one and whatnot. And so, like, I'm kind of not really wanting to look into this as much, partially because that article, again, way too long. Really good article, just way too long. The years 1910. Milton, also really good, famous economist, also whatever. Also held the opinion that this move did not cause a Great Depression. We already went over that. Most economists, both liberal and conservative, doubt that Smoot-Hawley played much of a role in the subsequent contraction. So, and kind of went over that a little bit, but even Wikipedia, which again is going to right now is going to probably try to characterize tariffs as bad because of Trump. Is saying like not as substantial, subsequent of, not as significant as of a thing, and there was a bit of contradictory in that other article as well, in those other two articles as well, in that like they were saying like, yeah, I mean, like, it definitely contributed, but we actually don't know how much it like we think it was. It's almost more of a, it seems like it significantly contributed, but it might not have actually. There's actually a bit of a valid argument that maybe it actually didn't, is basically what those were saying. And so we don't know. So we don't entirely know. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, there's so many factors with this stuff that, like, you can't just point out one thing and be like, oh yeah, this caused it, right? And then we already went over that, and can't just point out one thing and be like, oh yeah, this was definitely the biggest factor or whatever, you know? Okay, so the answer to did it cause a Great Depression is a definite no, because like the Smoot-Hawley tariff did not even come into effect beforehand, and yeah, there was high-ish tariffs beforehand, but high tariffs were not new to the U.S. and high tariffs had actually been a long-standing thing before that. And if anything, it almost seems as if lower tariffs might have even been more of a factor. And like trying and attempts at globalizing economies had been more of a factor. That's almost what it seems like to me, personally. Now, okay. So now that we've answered that, finally, I was going to go over all this stuff, but I mean, this was such a long thing. I think I'm actually going to end here, and I will come back another day. Thank you for watching. If you stuck with me all this way, if you did, I'm sorry. I would almost pay you because I know of how tedious this was. But if you did, thank you. And you know what? I am curious why you did even. Leave a comment. Just, I'm curious what actually caused you to stay with me all this way. Because if you were interested and you liked it for whatever reason, maybe I will try to maintain that. All right. Thank you for watching if you see this. Peace.